Hi, I'm Lene Whitley-Putz, and I teach communication at Kenyatta College in Redwood City and at Foothill College in Los Altos. And I also teach writing at UC Santa Cruz, so I am the epitome of a freeway flyer. And I have a little story that I'd like to tell you today about how I started using technology in my classroom and why I started using technology in my classroom. But because I have to travel from campus to campus to campus, I'm going to make you travel with me along that road. So I'm not going to start with how I use technology, but rather how I started looking at professional development and why professional development is so important to me in my class and in my growth as a teacher too. So first of all, I teach in multiple disciplines. I have a degree in composition studies, but I also have a degree in communication. And because of that, I straddle two sometimes complementary programs and sometimes not complementary programs at all. And it's also interesting to me that I'm seen as a writing expert at my UC job and a communications expert in my community college jobs. And the role that they play with one another, the give and take that I have to go through in each one of those kind of houses that I live in. So one of the problems with being a freeway flyer is that you're constantly being asked to teach different courses at different campuses, and the different campuses have different calendars. I teach on the quarter system and the semester system. So if you're teaching a course on the semester system and they ask you to teach the same course on the quarter system, it's not like you say, oh yes, I've taught that course before, it's not a problem. It's a major job to refit the class from 16 weeks to 10 weeks. So early on, I really availed myself to professional development so that I could become better at tailoring my classes to the needs of the campus. The whole idea, thinking to myself that no way could the economic situation in California get any worse or last too long, so eventually I would make myself into this great candidate for a full-time job. Still waiting. So I started taking workshops on developing and designing my courses, where my intention was really looking at the design of my course. And so one of the early workshops that I did was on Understanding by Design, which is a book that's written by Grant Wiggins. And there's a lot of peripheral things that go along with it, but the whole idea is that you're looking at the goals of your course. And that definitely means that you're designing SLOs. And for some people, you might think to yourself, oh, I'm going to stop watching right now. But actually, I love SLOs, and I hope that by listening to me that maybe you'll like them a little more also. And so I was really interested in looking at what my outcomes and my objectives were in my courses. And I was starting to feel a couple of different things. One, that because of my writing background, my communication classes looked like writing classes. So all of my assessments were very, very written-based. And I had a lot of essays, and not all students respond well to that much writing in a class when they're not really supposed to be taking a writing class. And I also wanted to know, I had a lot of activities. Communication can be a very, very fun classroom. But if you have a lot of activities, and every day is an activity, and they're not adding up to something, you might have a class that's very, very fun for students, but in the end, they don't necessarily have what you wanted them to have. So sometimes you have to choose and choose wisely. So I was very interested in starting to pick and choose the activities that I used in my classroom and trying to figure out how am I actually going to help my students to these goals, what activities will give them what they need in order to reach the goals of the class. And Understanding by Design asks you to do that by looking at those goals and kind of looking backwards, designing backwards in your class to make sure that any activity or assessment that you're doing builds to those goals. But it also asks you to do something else. It asks you to say, not only how does this activity build to the goal, but what other skills, what other pieces of knowledge, what other attitudes do my students need to have in order to be able to fill the assessment? Okay, so for instance, I'll use an example. In communication studies, we have a concept called convergence. And the idea is that groups use language in unique ways. They have rules and vocabularies or lexicons that they use that are only accessible to the group, and the group knows what they mean and nobody else knows what they mean. and that you get membership dependent upon how well you use this language. So for instance, I have a teenage son, he plays basketball. When the moms say, oh, that umpire was terrible, all the boys know that we're silly moms because in basketball you have a ref, not an umpire. So when I say to my students, well, you know, have you been to any concerts lately? And they tell me that they've just been to Coachella. I think to myself, is that at the outlets? Because I don't speak the language that my students are speaking. And when I'm teaching them communication, just like you teach whatever discipline you teach, I have a language that I'm trying to teach them. This is the language that communication experts use. This is the language that I want you to use in this class. There's lots of other things we teach in communication too, but I'm using this as an example because I think every discipline has a language that they want students to learn. The other piece of that is we often use assessments that are based, especially for vocabulary, that are based in the very lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy. So we're trying to push them toward critical thinking, but when we think about language, we often use assessments that are multiple choice, where they're actually just trying to define a word. Well, you can memorize a definition for a word, but if you can't apply it in the right situation, if you can't move up toward the higher level of critical thinking with that term, you're having a very, very low level of learning where that term is concerned. So I'm really interested in my classes, not that my students can match a definition to a word, but rather that they can move up more toward the higher level critical thinking and apply the concept to something in their assignments. So I have this challenge. How am I going to do that with my students? So I was developing lots of different ways to richly embed language in my classroom. They did vocabulary and journal assignments where they had to actually define a vocabulary word and use it in their journal. They did quizzes to reinforce that they actually knew the definition of the term. They had in-class presentations. These were often group presentations where I would give them a related set of concepts and ask them to come up and give a mini presentation about what it meant to that particular unit. And then they would have to use these concepts in their essays. What I was finding, however, was that they would have mini presentations and they would come up, the whole group would get up there and they'd give a definition for the terms that they had, and they'd be wrong. I think to myself, wow, why aren't they like trying harder? Why do they continue to use the words incorrectly? So this piece of my course was not working well for me. And the sad thing was that it was a very important piece of the course because how could they do the larger, more summative assessments where they were being required to use the language if they weren't understanding the language in the first place? So the journal assignment kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I kept putting more weight to the journal assignment. I kept adding more instructions to the journal assignment, more examples to the journal assignment in an effort to try to get my students to take it seriously, to understand how the language was a building block to success in the class. I wanted them to learn the communication lingo. So one of the things that I said was, you now have to define 5 terms for every chapter. We have 14 chapters in the book, so over the course of the semester, they were doing a ton of definitions. And that they had to use those terms then in their reflective journal. More importantly, I also felt like I needed to teach them what academic writing was, so they had to do it in APA style. What I found over the course of the semester, first of all, let's look at what it was actually taking them to do this assignment. So there's the content piece of that, which is defining the terms and knowing the term, being able to apply the terms. So there's that lower level of understanding in Bloom's taxonomy, moving all the way up to the application level in Bloom's taxonomy. But then there was the task portion of it. What are my students being asked to do? What other knowledge and skills and attitudes do they have to draw on in order to be able to make this happen? Well, they have to be good readers. If they're not good readers, they're not going to be able to figure out the textbook. They're not going to even be able to figure out what a key term actually is and why I'm asking them to define it. They have to be able to cite using APA style. And though I gave them links to produce OWL and other resources for APA, they still need to be able to follow the directions for that or ask questions. They need to be able to identify the author. This is kind of crazy making because the author of the book is on the book cover. But in our textbook, however, it's a breadth textbook. So there would often be long summaries of all the work done by multiple authors. So in the text, embedded in the citations, were all of these authors' names and dates. And students would get confused. Am I citing the author of our textbook? Am I citing the author that our authors are citing? Who's the author of this particular concept? It would be very confusing for them. They'd also have to identify the date of publication. It seems easy to those of us who are used to doing this work. It's at the beginning of the book. But for the students who see these embedded authors' names and all of the matching and corresponding dates, it's very, very confusing. And then they have to be able to acknowledge then those secondary sources. Is a concept coming from our authors, or are our authors using other authors to get to that concept? So though the vocabulary seems like a low-level assignment, it's actually a very complex assignment that takes a lot of unpacking for the students. So let's just go back to the goals of the assignment again. Help students learn the language of communication, define 5 terms per chapter, and use those terms in a reflective journal. Here was my assignment. Now, of course, I don't expect you to read this assignment. It's impossible to read this assignment. It's 5 times longer than the product that I wanted from them. But in an effort to try to get them to do it correctly after years of doing this and committed to the idea that this is really important, they should learn how to do this, I kept making a longer and longer and longer assignment. I'm sure by the time this iteration occurred, students were no longer even reading it. I would pass out the assignment. It was actually in their course packet that they would get with their syllabus. I'm sure they looked at it and put it aside. And that's all that ever happened to it. So it had an example in it. It had links to where they could look up APA. It had a rationale, why you have to learn this, why it's so important. And ironically, it still wasn't happening. What was happening instead is that the students who were doing a bad job at the beginning of the semester were doing just about a job at the end of the semester. The students who were brilliant at it already knew it before they came into the class. So they were adding to their vocabulary, but they certainly weren't adding to those skills that they already knew. Besides that, it was attached to a journal entry in an interpersonal communication class. So I had students that were telling me about rape, students that were telling me about conflicts that caused severe distress to them. It's not like I could take a great journal entry and show it to everyone, copy it, and say, here's a student model for you. Okay? It didn't happen. So I had poor content quality, misuse of APA. It was difficult to grade, and very, very few student models that I could use. In essence, what I had was a closed classroom. When my students left, they were on their own, and there was no way for me in any way to reach out to them and help them do a better job. This is what the homework looked like. Read chapter 5, define your 5 terms, do your journal, and then they were supposed to go to that really intense sheet with all the directions on it. So I entered a climate of change. A couple of things happened that pushed me to another level, and this is really what I want to share with you today. First of all, our campus started a big response to SB 1440. So we were asked to revise our SLOs to align with the state. So I was really carefully looking at the SLOs for this particular course and trying to determine exactly what we were trying to teach our students. And it became crystal clear to me that this vocabulary piece was critical to them, and I needed to do a better job teaching it. So my goals were to look at those SLOs and then refine my assessments and refine my activities so that I could actually teach to those SLOs. And then I was also given an opportunity for DE training. And at that time, there was a couple of things that were happening. I thought to myself, okay, I can learn a couple of tricks to incorporate into my brick and mortar class so that I can expand the walls of my classroom. And I thought, okay, with my minimal understanding of technology, I can create a discussion forum. And in the discussion forum, they'll start using those terms correctly, and they'll learn the vocabulary of my particular field. And then I thought, even better, I can automate my quizzes. So this is going to be a time-saving activity for me. Okay. So what I found going through the first few examples of professional development, though, was that there were a lot of people who were just excited about the technology and the tool, and it was all about tools, 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 tools. And I was really concerned about the pedagogy. I'm just not going to adopt a tool because it's the coolest, newest thing. I want to make sure I'm choosing the right tool for what I'm trying to do. Even more than that, I thought I was going to learn discussion forums. When I got my first course shell, I clicked on the button for adding an activity to my course shell, and there were 30 things to choose from. And the person who was kind of supporting me and urging me on was like, try them all, try them all. I was like a kid in a candy store, only I wanted chocolate, and there was only, fruit-flavored things, okay? So I sought out some more professional development. I took some @1 courses, which were very helpful to me because they married pedagogy, and I read a lot of books. And that led me to looking at a couple of things. Number one, my understanding of backward design and marrying it with the iNACOL standards. I chose these ones to kind of point out because these ones I thought, whether you're in a face-to-face class, a hybrid class, or an online class, every class should do these things. So I was interested in active learning, participation, collaboration, feedback to my students. How am I going to move them from doing poor vocabulary assignments at the beginning of the semester to doing better vocabulary assignments at the end of the semester? And legal, ethical, safe behavior, valid and reliable assessments, and how those assessments connect to my SLOs. So I was asking myself, what technology tools, out of the 30 tools that I had available to me, which ones are actually going to have to help me teach this vocabulary? What's going to help me grow? And how am I going to harness my students to help each other? I really felt that somewhere it was the answer was nested in the fact that some of these students did it so well. If I could just get them to share that knowledge with each other, I would be so much better off. And how can I design the assignments to make these goals clear? Instead of creating a longer and longer and longer journal assignment with more and more words in a smaller and smaller font, how can I actually make it clear to them what they're doing? So I used a glossary tool I used a Moodle course shell. And what it allowed me to do was use a really low risk formative assessment that was worth very little points. It gave me an opportunity to reinforce knowledge and comprehension by giving them immediate feedback. They posted their glossary entry, and I could give them immediate feedback on it. And I could use it to build to higher order tasks, such as analysis in their analysis papers. So this was my assignment prior to using my course shell for vocabulary. It's beautiful. And this is my new assignment. Big, big difference. Two really important things are the fact that there's links to the instructions that are in the course packet for how to do a glossary entry, and there's links to the rubric. So every single time students log on to put a glossary entry in, there is a link to the rubric and a link to the instructions again. Here's the modified instructions compared to the huge page that there was before. And here's an example. This is an example that I wrote where everything's correct in APA, I hope. And here is the rubric that the students can click on. Much easier to use, much easier to read than the former. And then the most important piece for me is that my course shell allowed me to take a random glossary entry out of the unit and put it right on the front course page. So when students log on, each and every time they log on, here's a random entry. They see it, it's their work, they see each other's work, and every single time they log on, it changes. So not only are they hopefully reading the chapter, they're reading each other's glossary entries and seeing each other's glossary entries as an example. So I want to show you a student. This is her very first glossary entry. It's horrible. This is a student, a reentry student. She came to me and said that she was very afraid of writing, that she hadn't written in years, and anything that she had written at work had been criticized. She felt that her grammar was terrible, and she felt like her understanding of the key terms was low. So she was very concerned about doing the glossary entry that was going to be up on the main page. Her first glossary entry. This is her glossary entry mid-term, and you can see that it's all of a sudden correctly citing the book using APA format, has page numbers, has quotes, and it has the application. And then her final journal glossary entry. There's many more between this, and you can see just from looking at this one student the progression from the beginning of the course to the end of the course. This is a result that I had never had in my face-to-face course. And this is not a single example. Over and over again, I looked at the students' glossary entries, and there was almost a sense of competition with them. Sometimes they would send me a back channel email and say, oh, I just logged on and my glossary entry was up. They were so excited. So it really was, for me, an example of how choosing your technology tool correctly can enhance your students' understanding of the goals of the course. And so it reinforces for me that we can be in charge of the technology in our class, and that we can use design and the design of the technology to actually encourage and enhance learning in our class, which was my original goal in the first place. So I like to say that I spent 22 years learning how to expand the walls of my classroom, and one glossary entry tool allowed me to do the task I've been trying to do for 20 years. Thank you.